Walk into almost any clothing retailer built in the last 20 years, and somewhere near the fitting rooms, you'll find a mirror significantly larger than anything you'd ever install in your own bedroom. Often angled just slightly, lit with a warmth no overhead fluorescent tube in the rest of the store comes close to matching. Most shoppers walk past it, glance into it, and think nothing more of it than that's just where the mirror happens to be. Here's the detail that should stop you. That mirror was very likely selected, positioned, and even tilted by someone with a specific job. Sometimes an actual title like Retail Environment Designer or Visual Merchandising Strategist, using research on lighting temperature, reflection angle, and even a decades-old finding from psychology about what happens to human behavior the instant a person catches their own reflection. The size wasn't chosen because a bigger mirror simply looks nicer. The size, the angle, and the lighting around it were chosen because a mirror is one of the most quietly powerful psychological tools available to a retailer, capable of doing several completely different jobs at once. Some of them working in your favor, some of them working directly against your wallet, and almost none of them things you were ever meant to notice happening. I'm going to tell you why stores use such enormous mirrors, and I promise you the real answer branches into several genuinely different mechanisms, not just one simple trick. Here's what's ahead. I'm going to walk you through the actual retail history behind oversized mirrors, tracing back to the first department stores of the 19th century, and why the technique spread everywhere almost overnight once one retailer proved it worked. We'll break down the specific psychological research on self-awareness in mirrors, a classic study that found something genuinely surprising about how people behave differently the moment they can see themselves, and how retailers have applied that finding in two completely opposite directions depending on what they're trying to sell you. I'll show you the engineered fitting room mirror industry specifically, the measurable science behind tilt angles and lighting temperature that some retailers use to make you look better, and why that flattering reflection is doing more to your spending than almost anything else in the entire store. And by the end, you'll understand why that mirror was never simply there to help you check your outfit. It was there to change your behavior in several different ways at once, and it's been working on shoppers for close to 200 years. Think of a large store mirror not as a passive object reflecting light back at you, but as a kind of silent employee, one who never speaks, never wears a name tag, and yet actively shapes how long you stay, how you feel about yourself while you're there, and in some documented cases, whether you decide to put something back on the shelf or walk out with it in your bag. A normal employee has to be trained, paid, and can only interact with one customer at a time. A well-placed mirror interacts with every single person who walks past it continuously, all day, without ever needing a break, and unlike a salesperson whose influence you'd consciously notice and potentially resist, a mirror's influence operates almost entirely below the level of conscious awareness, which is precisely what makes it such an effective, if invisible, part of the retail environment's design. This practice actually began at a specific historical moment, not through scattered individual decisions gradually adding up, and understanding that origin makes the modern version far less surprising. In the mid-1800s, a French entrepreneur named Aristide Boucicaut transformed a small Paris shop into what's widely credited as the world's first true department store, Le Bon Marché, and among the many genuinely radical innovations he introduced, fixed prices, browsing without obligation to buy, elaborate window displays, was the deliberate, extensive use of large mirrors throughout the shopping floor. Boucicaut and the retail innovators who studied and copied his methods across Europe and America understood something that retail historians have written about extensively since, that mirrors accomplished two powerful things simultaneously inside a commercial space. First, they made a physical space feel dramatically larger and more abundant than its actual square footage. Since a mirrored wall doubles, visually, the apparent depth of a room and the apparent quantity of merchandise displayed within it, an illusion of grandeur and plenty that department stores specifically wanted associated with the shopping experience they were selling. Second, mirrors gave customers, particularly women in an era when public self-inspection outside the home was still considered somewhat improper in many social contexts, a socially sanctioned reason to linger, to pause, to look, extending the amount of time a shopper spent physically inside the store simply admiring their own reflection amid the merchandise. Time that translated directly into more browsing, more exposure to additional goods, and ultimately more purchases. Here's a specific architectural precedent worth knowing, because it shows the same core insight that mirrors manipulate the felt experience of a space existed even before retail borrowed it. The Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, built in the late 1600s under Louis XIV, lined an entire long gallery with mirrors specifically to amplify the impression of the room's grandeur, reflecting the natural light pouring in from the opposing windows and creating a sense of endless, doubled space designed to overwhelm visitors with the perceived scale and wealth of the French monarchy. Retail historians studying the rise of the department store have directly connected this earlier architectural tradition, using mirrors to manufacture a feeling of abundance and grandeur beyond what a space's actual dimensions would otherwise convey to the commercial version that emerged 2 centuries later on the shopping floor. The psychological trick is identical in both cases, only the goal shifted from impressing visiting dignitaries with royal power to encouraging a shopper to linger a few minutes longer and perceive the store itself as a place of luxurious abundance rather than a simple room full of merchandise for sale. The psychology specifically is where the story gets genuinely more interesting than simple spatial illusion, and it involves one of the more surprising findings in all of social psychology. In the 1970s, researchers Edward Diener and Mark Walbaum ran an experiment that's become a foundational reference point in the study of self-awareness, giving participants a task with a built-in opportunity to cheat when they believed no one was watching. The critical manipulation was simple. Some participants completed the task in a room with a mirror positioned so they could see their own reflection while working. Others completed the identical task with no mirror present at all. The results were striking. Participants who could see themselves in the mirror cheated dramatically less than participants working without any reflection visible, a finding that's been replicated and extended across numerous follow-up studies in the decades since, generally supporting a broader psychological theory called objective self-awareness, the idea that seeing your own reflection triggers a shift in cognitive focus from your immediate impulses toward your internalized standards and values, essentially making you briefly more like an outside observer, evaluating your own behavior rather than simply acting on instinct. Here's where retailers have applied this exact finding, and it explains a specific, well-documented use of mirrors that has nothing to do with flattering lighting or spatial illusion at all: loss prevention. Retail security consultants have written directly about installing strategically placed mirrors, including the large, convex security mirrors you've likely seen mounted near ceiling corners in smaller shops, specifically because self-awareness triggered by seeing your own reflection has been shown to measurably reduce impulsive, dishonest behavior, including shoplifting. A shopper who catches a glimpse of themselves reaching toward an item, even peripherally in a store mirror, is, according to the underlying psychological research, statistically less likely to follow through on an impulsive theft than a shopper who never sees their own reflection at all during that same moment of temptation. This is a genuinely different mechanism than the spatial illusion mirrors we discussed a moment ago, and it reveals something important about why store mirrors come in such different forms depending on where you find them. The small, angled convex mirror mounted in a ceiling corner of a convenience store is doing loss prevention work, leveraging self-awareness to discourage theft. The enormous, flattering, warmly lit mirror near a fitting room is doing something almost entirely different. And in some ways, almost that fitting room mirror specifically is where retail design has become genuinely, measurably scientific, and where the engineering behind a single reflective surface gets remarkably detailed. Retail environment designers and lighting consultants have spent years researching and testing the specific combination of factors that make a fitting room mirror image feel flattering rather than harsh. And the findings have converged on a few consistent variables that show up across countless retail design case studies and trade publications. Lighting temperature matters enormously, with warmer color temperatures generally in a range closer to what's often described as soft white or warm white lighting, measurably reducing the visibility of skin blemishes and shadows compared to the harsh, cooler, blue-tinted fluorescent lighting still common in many big box retailers and notoriously in most public restrooms. Several well-known specialty retailers have been directly credited in retail design press coverage with popularizing deliberately warm, almost golden-toned fitting room lighting, specifically because customer testing showed shoppers reported feeling more confident and completed noticeably more purchases under that warmer light compared to standard retail fluorescent lighting. Angle matters just as much as lighting, and this is the detail most shoppers have genuinely never consciously registered, even though it's been shaping their reflection for years. Retail fixture manufacturers producing fitting room mirrors have documented, in industry trade materials, a specific, deliberate practice of installing mirrors with a slight forward tilt, sometimes only a few degrees, angled so the top of the mirror leans marginally toward the viewer relative to the bottom. This subtle tilt creates a mild, barely perceptible elongation effect, visually lengthening the appearance of the legs and slimming the overall silhouette reflected back. An effect well documented in photography and optics as a natural consequence of shooting or viewing a reflection from a slightly elevated or angled perspective rather than dead on. Several specialty apparel and shapewear retailers have been reported in industry coverage over the years to deliberately specify this tilt angle as a standard requirement across their fitting room installations, treating it as a genuine competitive tool, since a shopper who looks measurably better in a store's own mirror than they typically look in a flat mirror at home is, according to internal retail testing repeatedly cited across the industry, significantly more likely to complete a purchase of the item they're currently trying on, and meaningfully less likely to return it later once they get it home and see themselves under different lighting. Here's a comparison that makes the financial stakes of this concrete. Retail return rates for apparel purchased in store have historically run considerably lower than return rates for the same categories of clothing purchased online. And while several factors contribute to that gap, retail analysts and fitting room designers have specifically pointed to the flattering, controlled lighting and mirror environment of a physical fitting room as part of the explanation, since a customer who forms a positive first impression of how an item looks on them under carefully engineered lighting and mirror conditions is documented to be less likely to reverse that positive impression later. A psychological pattern related to a well-known concept called anchoring, where an initial judgment continues to shape subsequent evaluations, even once the original conditions that produced it are no longer present. In plain terms, if the fitting room mirror made you feel great about how a dress looked on you, that initial feeling tends to stick with you even after you get home and try it on again under your own bathroom's considerably less flattering overhead light, protecting the sale from the kind of second guessing that drives a meaningful share of apparel returns. Let me give you a short scene that captures how this conversation actually happens inside the retail design industry, based on patterns described in trade publications and interviews with visual merchandising consultants over the years. A retail brand is redesigning its flagship store ahead of a new season, and the design consultant brought in to oversee the fitting room area doesn't start by asking what color the walls should be. The conversation centers on lighting temperature measured in Kelvin, mirror tilt measured in degrees, and internal conversion rate data comparing sales performance across store locations that had already piloted the warmer, tilted mirror setup against locations still using standard fixtures. The consultant recommends a specific lighting temperature shown in prior testing to produce the highest reported customer satisfaction with their own reflected appearance, and a mirror tilt within the narrow range other retailers in the same product category have already validated through their own internal testing. None of this conversation involves what the clothes will actually look like on a hanger. It's an engineering conversation about self-perception run with the same rigor a retailer might apply to inventory forecasting, because the fitting room mirror has, by this point in retail history, become just as measurable and just as optimizable a variable as shelf placement or checkout line design. Now, there's a genuinely important nuance worth adding here, because not every large store mirror is doing the same flattering, purchase-protecting work we've just described, and understanding the difference matters. Remember the self-awareness research from Diener and Walbaum, showing that seeing your own reflection can trigger more careful, more self-monitoring behavior rather than more impulsive behavior. Some retail environments deliberately lean into that opposite effect rather than the flattering fitting room strategy, particularly in contexts where a retailer wants to discourage impulsive behavior rather than encourage it, such as loss prevention mirrors near high theft merchandise, or in some documented cases, mirrors positioned near snack and candy displays in grocery stores. An application some retail psychology researchers have specifically studied in relation to healthier eating choices, finding that shoppers positioned where they could see their own reflection while browsing impulse food items showed measurably reduced likelihood of selecting less healthy options compared to shoppers browsing the identical display with no mirror present. This means the same physical object, a mirror, can be deliberately engineered to produce essentially opposite behavioral outcomes depending entirely on where in the store it's placed, what merchandise sits near it, and what specific customer behavior the retailer is actually trying to influence in that particular section of the floor. A fitting room mirror wants you relaxed, flattered, and comfortable enough to commit to a purchase. A mirror near an unattended high-value display wants you suddenly uncomfortably aware that you're being watched, even when the only thing actually watching is your own reflection. It's worth returning to the spatial illusion mechanism for a moment and updating it with how modern retailers have refined the original 19th century department store insight. Contemporary retail design research on small format stores, boutiques, and pop-up shops has continued to confirm what Boucicault essentially discovered by trial and error nearly 2 centuries ago, that mirrored surfaces measurably increase a shopper's perception of a space's size and the apparent quantity of merchandise on display, an illusion particularly valuable for smaller retailers who can't afford the square footage of a big box competitor but still want customers to perceive the shopping experience as spacious and abundant rather than cramped. Retail design consultants working with boutique and specialty store clients have specifically recommended strategic mirror placement as a comparatively low-cost way to create this perception of expanded space, and several retail design case studies have documented measurable increases in reported customer satisfaction with the shopping environment following mirror-focused renovations, even when the store's actual physical footprint remained completely unchanged. The 19th century insight never went away. It simply got more precisely targeted. Applied now with specific data on exactly which wall placements and mirror dimensions produce the strongest perceived space effect for a given room layout, rather than the more general, intuitive approach early department store owners were working with. There's one more layer worth covering because it explains why certain retailers, particularly those selling clothing associated with body image sensitivity, treat fitting room mirror design as something close to a core brand strategy rather than a minor operational detail. Several apparel brands operating in categories like shapewear, swimwear, and bridal fashion, categories where customers are documented to experience unusually high levels of body image anxiety during the shopping and fitting process, have been reported in industry coverage to invest disproportionately heavily in fitting room, lighting, and mirror engineering compared to other apparel categories, explicitly because the emotional stakes of that specific mirror moment are so much higher for their particular customer base. Bridal salons in particular have been described in industry interviews using specifically calibrated three-way mirror setups, combining the flattering angle and lighting principles already discussed with the added psychological effect of seeing multiple simultaneous angles of the same reflection. A technique bridal industry consultants have directly connected to increased emotional impact and higher completion rates for that single, famously high-stakes purchase decision. The mirror in these specific retail categories isn't simply supporting the sale. In some documented cases, retail consultants working in bridal and shapewear specifically describe the mirror experience itself as the actual product being sold, with the garment functioning almost as the vehicle for producing that engineered emotional reflection rather than the primary object of the transaction. A comparison across two very different kinds of stores brings this together because the contrast makes the entire pattern easy to spot going forward. Walk into a discount big box retailer selling clothing as a secondary category alongside groceries and household goods, and you'll typically find fitting room mirrors that are functional at best, standard, cool white lighting, no tilt engineering, minimal investment in the psychological experience, because that retailer's business model depends on volume and low price rather than an emotionally engineered purchase decision. Walk into a specialty boutique, a bridal salon, or a premium apparel retailer competing specifically on experience and perceived quality, and the fitting room mirror investment increases dramatically. Warmer lighting, engineered tilt, sometimes even dedicated mirror lighting systems marketed directly to retailers by manufacturers specializing in exactly this niche, because that retailer's entire margin structure depends on customers feeling good enough about their reflection to commit to a purchase they might otherwise talk themselves out of. The size and quality of a store's mirrors, in other words, function as a surprisingly reliable signal of exactly how much that retailer's business model depends on emotionally engineered purchase decisions versus straightforward, price-driven volume sales. So, what do you actually do with this information the next time you're standing in front of a suspiciously flattering fitting room mirror? First, recognize that your reflection in a specialty retailer's fitting room is very likely engineered to look measurably better than your reflection at home through documented, deliberate choices in lighting temperature and mirror angle, which means the confident, positive feeling you experience in that moment isn't necessarily an accurate preview of how the item will look once you're back under your own bathroom light. Second, if you're making a significant purchase decision, particularly for an item you're genuinely uncertain about, consider stepping outside the fitting room area entirely, into the main store's more neutral lighting, or even photographing yourself on your phone. Since a phone camera's flash and standard lighting will generally give you a more accurate, less engineered impression than the specifically calibrated fitting room mirror ever will. Third, understand that a store's investment in its mirror experience, warm lighting, deliberate tilt, three-way setups is itself information about that retailer's business model, a signal that emotional, in the moment purchase decisions matter significantly to how that business generates revenue, which is worth keeping in mind if you're someone who tends to make more impulsive decisions under exactly the kind of flattering conditions that environment is specifically engineered to produce. Fourth, remember the opposite side of this story too, that mirrors placed elsewhere in a store, particularly near unattended merchandise, are frequently doing the reverse psychological work, increasing self-awareness specifically to encourage more careful, deliberate behavior, which means the same reflective surface can be either your ally or a quiet nudge toward caution, depending entirely on where in the store you happen to be standing when you catch sight of yourself. Here's the identity level point I want you to leave with. The oversized mirror in your favorite store was never simply there to help you check whether an outfit fits. It's a modern descendant of a nearly 200-year-old retail strategy, refined over generations from a simple architectural trick for making rooms feel grander into a precisely engineered psychological tool, calibrated in specific degrees of tilt and specific temperatures of light, designed to shape exactly how you feel about yourself in the 30 seconds before you decide whether to buy what you're wearing. Understanding the mechanism doesn't mean every flattering reflection is manipulative in some sinister sense, and it doesn't mean you should distrust every mirror you encounter from now on. It means you get to notice consciously the moment a reflection is making you feel unusually good, and ask yourself honestly whether that feeling is coming from the item itself or from 2 centuries of accumulated retail psychology working exactly as intended on the light bouncing back at you. Here are your 3 takeaways. 1. The modern, oversized retail mirror traces directly back to 19th century department store innovation, deliberately deployed to make physical spaces feel larger and more abundant than their actual square footage, a strategy borrowed from even older architectural traditions, like the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, and one that remains a documented, cost-effective tool for boutique and specialty retailers today. 2. Mirrors trigger a real, well-documented psychological state called objective self-awareness, and retailers deploy that same underlying mechanism in 2 nearly opposite ways depending on placement, using flattering, warmly lit, subtly tilted fitting room mirrors to encourage confident purchase decisions, while using plainer, more exposing mirrors near unattended merchandise specifically to discourage impulsive theft or unhealthy choices. 3. The specific engineering behind a flattering fitting room, lighting temperature, tilt angle, 3-way configurations is measurable, documented, and deliberately calibrated by retail design specialists, which means the confident feeling you get from a great-looking reflection in a store is often less a preview of reality and more the output of a carefully tested psychological system. Worth remembering the next time that reflection convinces you to buy something you'll see very differently once you're home. The next time you catch your reflection in an unusually large, unusually flattering store mirror, you'll know exactly what you're looking at. Not a coincidence of interior design. A nearly 2-century-old psychological strategy, refined down to the degree in the Kelvin, engineered specifically to shape how you feel about yourself in the 60 seconds that matter most to whether you make the purchase. If this changed the way you'll look at your next fitting room mirror, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.